I'm joined today by Johann Hari, author of the book Chasing the Scream, the First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. Johann, there's so much interesting stuff in here as far as addiction goes, as far as the origins of the war on drugs. The place where I want to start with you is, let's go back to the origins of the war on drugs. Many right-wingers in the US that I speak to do not want to concede that there were some racially tinged elements to the beginning of the war on drugs in the United States. Let's talk about that first.
If you'd said to me when I started the journey on doing this book 4 years ago, why did the war on drugs start? I would have guessed it was for the reasons that your average person on the street would give if you stop them now. You know, you don't want kids to use drugs, you don't want people to become addicted. What was fascinating going back and looking all through the archives is there wasn't just a racially tinged element to it. The entire debate was about race. Those things that we think about barely came up. It's really shocking when you read it. I tell this story in the book through the story of how Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, was stalked and killed by the man who launched the modern war on drugs, Harry Anslinger. And it's a really striking story, you know. She stands on stage in New York City, 1939. She sings the song Strange Fruit, a great anti-lynching song. And that night, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics order her to stop singing that song. And it's a really weird place, you think, to begin the story. You think, well, what has the Narcotics Bureau got to do with the song? It was founded, the drug war was founded by this crazy racist called Harry Anslinger. Really, he's the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. And he was obsessed with Billie Holiday because she was African American, not because she was an addict. It's very revealing. At the same time, he finds out two super famous people are heroin addicts, Judy Garland and Billie Holiday. Judy Garland, he advises her to take slightly longer vacations and reassures the studio she's going to be fine. Billie Holiday, he has her destroyed. Even on her deathbed, he has her arrested. Lots of her friends thought that he effectively killed her. You know, so it really tells you a lot about the origins of the drug war, that story.
And given the sort of dim-witted start that we got to this drug war, it shouldn't really come as much of a surprise that the results we claim to be waiting for, right, which are reductions in crime, reductions in drug usage, don't really seem to be happening as a result.
Well, it's the opposite. It, in fact, creates an enormous amount of crime. I spent a lot of time in the book with a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, called Chino Hardin, whose story I tell, an incredible person who was conceived when his mom, who was a crack addict, was raped by his dad, who was an NYPD officer. And Chino's story, I think, tells you about the dynamic that runs all over the world. When you ban drugs, they don't disappear, right? No one watching your show is so foolish they think that. What happens is they're transferred from the people who used to control them before the drug war and the people who control them in lots of countries today, doctors and pharmacists, and they're transferred into the hands of armed criminal gangs. Now that creates a whole wave of violence that otherwise wouldn't exist. If you or me go into your local liquor store and we try to steal the beer or the vodka, they just call the cops, right? Will be taken away. That liquor store doesn't have to be violent or intimidating. If we go up to your local weed dealer or your local coke dealer and we try to steal what they're selling, obviously they can't ring the cops. The cops would arrest them. They have to be violent and intimidating. They have to stage acts of theatrical violence that are so extreme that no one would dare to take them on. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, calculated that there are an additional 10,000 murders every year in the United States as a direct result of that dynamic. And it's not just dealers and cops who die in it. It's a lot of people who get caught in the way. Now, that's extreme enough in the United States. I went to northern Mexico. I interviewed one of the only people who's ever been at the heart of one of the deadliest Mexican drug cartels and lived to tell the story of how he butchered and beheaded over 70 people. That dynamic has destroyed Mexico. And I think a fact that every American should know, Michelle Leonhardt, the head of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, a woman whose wages you pay, was asked what she thought of the 60,000 civilian deaths in Mexico in the last 7 years. And the exact phrase she used was, "It's a sign of success in the war on drugs." That should be a national and international scandal. Americans are better than that.
And we're just starting to get some of the data now from the legalization. I don't want to call them experiments necessarily, but the initial instances of legalization here in the US, Colorado, and some data from Washington. But we can look at some other countries to look at longer term decriminalization and legalization and get a sense of what the impact could be, right?
It's really important, you're totally right, it's really important to understand there's no reason to have an abstract conversation about what ending the drug war looks like. It is being tried in practice in lots of places today, And I went to those places to see what they look like. I'll give you one example. For example, Portugal in the year 2000 had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year they tried the American way more and more. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people, and every year the problem got worse. In the year 2000, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and effectively said, look, we can't go on like this. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve this problem. So the panel goes away for a year and a half, and it came back and it said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial thing, take all the money we used to spend on arresting and imprisoning drug addicts, i.e. making them worse, and use all that money to reconnect them with the society. And it's important to understand what that means. Partly that's things that we think of as drug treatment in Britain and America. Rehab, psychological support, they have real value. But the biggest thing was something much more simple. It was about making sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. Really simple stuff, microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. It's been nearly 15 years since this experiment began in Portugal, the decriminalization of all drugs. And the results are in. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%. Overdose deaths are massively down. HIV transmission among adults is massively down. Street crime is significantly down. One of the ways you know it really worked is I went to interview this guy called João Figueira, who led the opposition to the decriminalization at the time. He was the top drug cop in Portugal. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug addicts prior to the decriminalization. And he hoped the whole world follows Portugal's example. Everywhere I went, but they've moved beyond the drug war. And I tell these stories in the book. Not only is there incredible successes, there's very few people who want to go back.
Yeah, and we recently interviewed a police officer from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition who had a very similar stories as the ones you tell. I want to get your thoughts on legalization versus decriminalization, because even amongst those in the U.S. who don't want to see all drugs be illegal, there's not necessarily consensus about legalization versus decriminalization and for which drugs. So how can we think about that?
It's worth explaining to people the difference. Decriminalization is generally used to mean where you don't punish people for using it or possessing it for their own personal use. Legalization is where you open up some route for them to legally buy it. And I think the crudest way to put it is decriminalization shuts down Orange is the New Black. Legalization shuts down Breaking Bad. So decriminalization gets rid of the problem where you're pointlessly arresting and imprisoning drug users and making their lives worse. Legalization is where you reclaim the drugs from armed criminal gangs and bankrupt those armed criminal gangs. Now, I'm in favor of both. So decriminalization is a route to legalization. I think decriminalization is a good start, but legalization is important. It's important to understand, though, what that means. Sometimes when you talk about legalizing drugs, people think, you're talking about there being a crack aisle in CVS. No one wants that. Maybe there's some crazy extreme libertarian who wants that, but virtually nobody wants that. So to understand, again, there's nothing abstract about this. Switzerland is an extremely conservative country. If it were an American state, it would be pretty much like Utah, right? I'm a Swiss citizen as well as a British citizen. And Switzerland has legalized heroin. And it's important to understand what that means. You think about how we regulate drugs already today, right? There are some drugs that you can go and just buy as an adult, like alcohol, a very powerful and toxic drug. There are other drugs you have to go to the doctor to get, right? Legalization is about expanding that kind of regulation to cover different drugs. So there's some we'll regulate like alcohol, like marijuana. In Switzerland, with heroin, they obviously haven't done that. What they've done is, if you're a heroin addict, you go to the doctor. The doctor will assign you if he believes you, he'll assign you to a clinic. You can go to that clinic up to 3 times a day, and you'll be given heroin, and you use it there. And what's really striking is I went to this clinic in Geneva. It looks like a fancy Manhattan hairdressers. People go in the morning, they inject their heroin, and then they go off to work. Overwhelmingly, they have jobs. They get their lives back together. Do you know how many deaths from overdose there have been in that clinic since it began 20 years ago? 0. None. Not a single one. Deaths from overdose don't happen anymore in Geneva, where that clinic is. Really striking. In Vancouver, when they opened a similar project, massive fall in overdose deaths. So it's important to understand legalization is already being tried with both what we think of as soft drugs in Colorado and Washington with really great results, and with harder drugs in Switzerland. And in both places, Switzerland, as I say, a very conservative country, they have voted twice in referenda by 70% to keep heroin legal for addicts. That tells you something about how well it works, not least because there was a massive fall in crime. A burglary fell enormously. Street prostitution ended. Really striking results.
Last thing I want to talk about, Johann, in the limited time we have left, is back to this topic of addiction specifically. And you talk in your book about the studies that have been done with rats, which have really changed our understanding of what it is that makes people addicted. And it's not quite so simple as heroin makes you addicted to heroin.
Yeah, it's fascinating. A series of experiments were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your viewers can do them at home if they're feeling a little bit sadistic. You get a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and will almost always kill itself. That's where we get our theory of addiction from. That's what we think addiction is. In the 70s, a guy called Bruce Alexander comes along, a professor in Vancouver, and he said, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park, and Rat Park is like heaven for rats. Everything a rat can want in life, it's got in Rat Park. It's got cheese and coloured balls and tunnels, loads of friends, it can have loads of sex. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever overdose. Now, there's really important human examples of this. They're happening all around us. I can tell you about. I know we're running out of time. But what Bruce says is this shows that both the right-wing and left-wing theories of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory is it's a moral failing. You're a hedonist. The left-wing theory is your brain gets hijacked. Bruce says it's not your brain. It's not your morality. It's your cage. Addiction is largely an adaptation to your environment. And there's really interesting human examples I can tell you about if we've got time. But that really shows the folly of the drug war approach. If what's driving addiction is disconnection and pain, the idea that we should impose more disconnection, we should in fact make it impossible for them to ever get jobs, and more pain on them, and the belief that that will make them stop is mad. I went out in Arizona, as I describe in Chasing the Scream, with a group of women forced to go out on chain gangs wearing T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict and made to dig graves. Those women are never going to work again. I went to the Hole, the solitary confinement unit, where they're put, and I saw these women, these drug addicts left in this cage, and I suddenly thought, wow, this is the closest you could possibly get to actually literally recreating the cages that guarantee addiction in animals. And this is what we do to stop them being addicted. It's madness. It's
total madness. And there's obviously so much more to talk about. And what I would love to do is once we get more data, not only from Colorado, but from the other states that are decriminalizing and legalizing in the US, we'll have you back and we'll really dig into that data. But in the meantime, I'll remind the audience that Johann Hari's book is Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. Comprehensive overview of all of the elements that play into modern day war on drugs. Johann, thank you for being on.
Thanks, David. I'll just say that people can get more information at the website chasingthescream.com as well. I'm thrilled to be on your show. Thanks, David.